Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for watching my show, William Wallace for America. As you all know, I always try to I'll bring on some good guests who like to talk about freedom, liberty, but most importantly, how to protect our constitutional values is getting more and more important. My guest today, I think, is going to do just that. But before I bring him on, please visit Bond Arms at bondarms.com. They're one of the sponsors that make this show possible. And with me today is Norm Pattis. Norm, thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled. I'm glad we could finally do this. You've been very, very persistent, and I've been a little spacey. So thank you for your patience.
Well, you're extremely busy. I mean, you're not only busy because you're busy, but busy because you're a good guy and a good attorney. And I can only imagine because you're not only Alex Jones's attorney, but you're also some J6ers, as they call them, attorneys. Is that true?
It is. Yeah, no, I continue to represent Alex Jones in his ongoing saga with the Sandy Hook families and their lawyers, more to the point. And I've represented one of the Proud Boys at the insurrection trial earlier in the year. I now represent two of them on appeal. I represent Owen Schroyer, a personality on InfoWars, who was sentenced to a period of incarceration as a result of his trespass on January 6th. We just filed appellate paperwork in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals yesterday, arguing that the judge unlawfully considered protected speech in sentencing him. I've got other J6 cases, and then the routine stuff that comes of being a criminal defense lawyer in a small state: murder, robbery, rape, and mayhem.
So you do all those.
I do. Well, I mean, I defend people who do those things. I try to desist from doing stuff like that.
Well, what's interesting is, and we're going to go into that in this. I'm getting ready to put your site up here, because I want people to be able to find you, as we go along. But what's interesting is I used to be the lock 'em up, one of those lock 'em up guys. Lock up all the bad guys. They violated our rights. Lock them up. But then the more that I start talking to people like yourself and talking about how our constitutional rights often get overlooked. I learned how many rights get violated in the process sometimes. And so I look at criminal justice reform, but sometimes that seems to be the dirty word. Criminal justice reform, the narrative is, if you mention criminal justice reform, it means that you're either too soft on crime or, you have to be one of the lock them up guys. But then the more I talk about the judges and people like yourself, I learned that we got to redesign a system, and that's maybe not the right way to say it, that can be reformed in a way that we reform the people that can be reformed and lock up the really bad, violent criminals. But even those guys need to be represented. And I'm sure that's what you're doing, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm inspired by the conviction that there is no group quite so dangerous as a self-righteous mob. And get yourself accused of a heinous crime, and you don't have any friends left in the world, or not many, and your lawyer is your best defense. And so I'll stand between the mob and the accused in any case, with a clean conscience and a happy spirit, because I think when we fight the state, in the easy cases, when it's easy to hate someone, and if we can confront that hatred, that naked power, that assertion of power, and hold it accountable there, it becomes easier to do in harder cases, at the margin. So, like Clarence Darrow, I like to say I'm an attorney for the damned. I mean, there was a magazine piece written about me some time ago, attorney for the despised. I'm not sure how I felt about that headline, but many people despise the people I represent.
What's interesting, you talk about easy. So it's easy to not like, the really bad ones, the rapists, the murderers that you say you're representing sometimes. And I like what your statement is, because it kind of gives a lot of explanation as to why you do that. But to give a little bit more explanation, why is it that you seem to have a clear conscience? And I'm getting the really bad people off our list, so to speak, because I think the bulk of our show is gonna cover that area between justice and constitutional rights that often is that gray area that gets trampled on. So to get the easy or the bad ones off the list, so to speak, how is it that you find it so easy to represent those really bad ones? Is it something that you feel is just a right, or is it something that you feel passionate about?
Both. A perfect case in point. Not too many years ago, maybe 7 or 8, I turned the television on one day to check the weather and the traffic before I leave the house, and I see a report. Man throws 7-month-old baby off the bridge, jumps back in. They can't find the baby. He's in life, he's in on life support in a hospital. I said to my wife, odds are I'll get that case, and I'd like to get it. 2 days or 3 days later, the phone rang, and guess what? It was his family. And so, here is a fellow who, in a dispute with his girlfriend, and was accused of taking their 7-month-old child and throwing it off the tallest bridge in the state. It went 100 feet down into the Connecticut River and unfortunately died. Um, there was something happened that day. He didn't become suddenly inhuman. His actions may have been unconscionable and inhuman, but understanding the person and presenting that person was to a judge and jury was the challenge. Now, in that case, the state was so outraged by his behavior that the plea offer was 50 years to serve on a guilty plea. He only faced 70 if he were convicted. And, we would have considered a plea in the 25-30 year range, but the state wouldn't do it. So we went to trial and he was convicted. And it was a case that my car was vandalized in the courthouse steps. I had people call me and leave me messages. One guy, or send me emails. One guy sent me an email, I hope you die of ass cancer. And, I thought about it for a while, and then I sent him a note back and I said, why would I want ass cancer when I have you? And so, uh, I greeted the client, in that case, Mr. Moreno, in court every day with a handshake. And I felt that, I would bear witness to the transition he made from a person presumed innocent, and do my best to present his point of view that it was something less than intentional murder, that he was overcome by emotion. The jury rejected that claim, but it's a fight I'd wage all over again because Tony was worth it.
Do you think there's a part of not only you, but maybe of all defense attorneys that while you are representing the bad people, the heinous people, the bad crimes, is there a part that says, hey, look, I recognize this guy is guilty or probably guilty or maybe guilty up to, innocent until proven guilty, but in the process, I'm doing society a service by processing them through the system. Because if it weren't for you, and what I mean by this is, like, if it weren't for you, no telling. I mean, the courts might run roughshod over that person, and maybe some people get their rights violated who are innocent in the meantime. Or maybe by you representing them, you're teaching the courts and the public something in the process, or helping the system work better, more efficiently.
The system is flawed, and I don't fundamentally believe that it's just. Clarence Darrow, more than a century ago, once said, "There is no justice in or out of court," and I believe that. I believe the criminal justice system is inhumane, and the sentences it imposes are heedless to the lives that people live. Routinely dealing out decades for bad deeds doesn't make it. It may make people feel good in the end, but it doesn't restore. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't restore anything. I hear people saying people need to face justice. That's an ungainly metaphor. It doesn't mean anything. I wouldn't know justice if it looked me in the face and said boo. And so for me, my motives are darker. I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. My father abandoned me as a child. My mother became unavailable as she coped with her own depression, and I had to raise myself in dire circumstances with unusual people. And I made it my life's work to be sure that the marginalized have a voice, because when I needed one, there was no one there for me. So my motives are more personal. If there's a collateral benefit and it benefits society, that's great. But I'd do it even if it didn't benefit society.
That's interesting. It almost sounds a little villainous, if you will. But the way I take it is, you've been there. You've been to the low spots. You know what it's like to be at a human's low. Maybe not as low as some of these other guys that you represent, but you have a deeper understanding that somebody's got to be there to kind of hold their hand to the system, even if they are the bad guy.
I take the Apostle Paul's view. All have fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're all sinners in need of grace. And at various points in my life, at my darkest moments, there were people who lent a hand, opened a door, gave me a shoulder to cry on, and they were instruments of grace in my life. If I can play that role in the lives of the despised, I will have contributed as much value to the world as I possibly can. And I'm honored to represent the despised and the accused, and would do so over and over and over again until death do me part this world.
And what I get from you, like I said, when I used to say I was used to be one of those lock up all the bad guy people, I used to think, also that attorneys like you were the lowest of the low. Who could represent, a rapist or a murderer? But when you say these kind of things, I kind of see that there's actually a human side to it. And while we have to, for society's benefit, get justice for the good people because of the bad people they're committing crimes, we have to keep a human side, because if we didn't have the human side that you're offering, all of society would just be killing people in the streets. I think if there was no justice and no compassionate people like yourself, justice or the courts would probably run roughshod, and
Um,
people with nefarious purposes would abuse that privilege to do so.
I like to say to prosecutors in a difficult case, there are two ways we can resolve this case. There's my way and the hard way. You choose. And when they choose the hard way, I make it as hard on them as I possibly can.
Okay, that's interesting. All right. Well, where do you? One question that I like to ask everybody in my podcast is, where do you think that freedom is under attack in America? And although the answer sometimes I bring people on like yourself, people might assume what your answer is going to be. It always surprises me the different answers I get. So, where do you think that freedom is under attack in America?
Well, I'm not sure I know what freedom is. I think that, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant once said that two things filled him with wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. In other words, the vastness of the universe and the fact that inchoately we seem to have standards of right and wrong that we weren't taught, but that we instinctively know to be true. I would add a third thing, and that is the fact of government. If you consider it, it's an amazing phenomena that millions of us can live together with ordered and settled expectations about the day. And I think the rule of law makes that possible. How we arrive at this collective sense of right and how we administer the rule of law matters a great deal. In the United States, we have a unique constitutional system that is designed to be inefficient. At the federal level, in many states, I think all states have copied this. We have separation of powers doctrine with checks and balances, where the executive can't do whatever it likes, neither can the judiciary, neither can the legislature. They all have, there's an interplay that's designed to be inefficient. With respect to governance in general in the United States, we have federalism, the division between state and federal powers. Again, another baked in inefficiency. Limiting what any government can do, both state or federal, is the Bill of Rights and the guarantees that are embedded within it. Whether those are unlimited, unenumerated, whether we have natural rights or not, these are all topics that philosophers debate. But we have an active Bill of Rights in the United States right now, and we have a government that's designed to be inefficient so that we can have ordered liberty. So where do I think freedom is under attack right now? In the wake of COVID, I think the expectations about a public health state and emergency powers and that grant to state and local government the ability to make us safe. And we see the architecture of the public health state at work in the debate about guns, in the debate about what to do about the internet, in the debate about hate speech, in the debate about public health, in the debate about global warming, in the debate about systemic racism. Everywhere you look, there is a group of people who know best how you and I should live. And if you agree with them, that's justice, that's truth and beauty. If you don't, who the hell are these people to
Right.
stand on my porch and tell me I got to do this or that? I got to take a jab. I got to pay reparations. I've got to turn left when everybody else turns left. I stand with I'm a contrarian. As I said before, there is no mob like a self-righteous mob. And so the checks and balances, the Bill of Rights matter to me. The issues that concern me the most, I've litigated COVID issues in federal appellate courts around the country and the Connecticut Supreme Court as well. We're getting ready to file a petition in the U.S. Supreme Court about mask mandates. I am also very involved in freedom of speech fights. I represent Alex Jones. Tried to get one of his cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. They wouldn't hear it. We may go back. I represent the Proud Boys in their criminal case. I represent Owen Schroyer in a J6 case. In these cases, there was an effort on the part of the government to criminalize speech. And I can tell you to a moral certainty that the FBI stands with respect to the right in much the way law enforcement did to the left in the 1970s. There are confidential human sources reporting on domestic activities of Americans when those activities cross a threshold that somebody in power decides makes them dangerous. You're a conservative Roman Catholic. you're a white male who belongs to a group of white men, then you're suddenly an extremist and a white supremacist. Unless you roll over and die to the woke mob and adopt an identity that says yours is suspect, you suddenly become a suspect. So I think freedom is under attack because we've lost sight of the core values that make this republic great. We're living on the decaying capital of a couple millennia of the Judeo Christian tradition. We've now embraced pluralism and diversity for the sake of diversity, and we have ridiculous disputes in school districts about transgender story hours. We have a Supreme Court justice of the United States who can't define what a woman is. We try too hard to make diversity into a new God, and we've forgotten the Judeo Christian God that was at the center of everything that we've created in this culture. And as a result, we stand ready to lose it all. So, where do I think freedom is most under assault? I think there's a culture war going on in the United States. There's a sense of expressive individualism that every difference is worshipped for the sake of diversity, and we've become a society of madmen. I'm reminded, I think it's in the prophet Isaiah. Once say the pot to the potter, why makest me thus? Um, there is a sense, as Augustine pointed out, that sin is love of the wrong thing. We're a society of sinners who've forgotten the need for grace. We're self righteous victims demanding that others recompense us for the injuries that we hold dear. And we've lost sight of the fact that the Ten Commandments come down to the following: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. We love ourselves more than anything else. And the result is we've become a society of raving lunatics.
This right here, what you just, that answer illuminated even more of a reason to your passion in life and defending the guilty. It shows the compassionate human side of people, that without that compassionate human side and the forgiveness, and like you said, keeping in mind what our creator put us here for, in this world, if we forgot that compassion, we would have a society that would be willy-nilly and stoning people to death for the smallest of crimes. But also, what you shine the light on is something that I've talked about before on my show. I actually did a podcast. I'm getting ready to drop it pretty soon too, on forgiveness. And
Mm.
as a society, we have forgotten about forgiveness and how powerful forgiveness is, not just for the human spirit, but how even more so for our society. And you're an example of that. Even some of the most heinous people in some people's opinions, forgiveness is more powerful than criminalization or locking them up. Sometimes that can be more powerful for society and beneficial for society. And that's kind of what I'm understanding you're saying. Is that correct?
You're way ahead of me. I don't think in such big terms. I'm involved in day-to-day disputes with people. I just know that I'm a sinner constantly in need of grace. And I know that if I were left to my own devices, I would always love the wrong thing and I'd be diminished in doing so. Consider everything that's going on with artificial intelligence. We're there, and the mind-body problem. You and I both possess brains. Some of our viewers may disagree with that, but we know it to be true. um, and there has always been a debate. What's the relation of our sense of selves, our mind, our spirit, as it were,
Mm.
to our brains? Are we merely a series of complex interactions, or are we more? Now, artificial intelligence wants to replicate a human being. We want to get to the point of being able to design a machine that can become human, but I don't think we ever will, because I think there's something distinctive about us. And Augustine nailed it in the Confessions. We have longing. Augustine says in the very first page of the Confessions, I will know no rest until I find my rest in thee. Find me a computer that longs to know God, and I will tell you you've created a human, but you'll never do it. And so we get to the point of we have these ridiculous debates on college campuses about the multiverse. If you consider the concept of infinity, well, if there's an infinite amount of space and time, then anything that you can imagine becomes not just possible, but probable, because there's so much space and time, yada, yada, yada. But you get to the paradox. I think it was Fermi's paradox. All this space, and there's only one human being, one human species, and it's right here on Earth. And so, how is it that this disconfirming hypothesis came about? We're led to believe it's perfectly reasonable to conclude that we might be avatars in a video game being played in a universe we don't know about. But it's ridiculous to say that we were created, not made, that we were created in the image of God, and that we find our rest in knowledge of God. When did that become ridiculous? I
Right.
think more ridiculous hypothesis is that I'm in an avatar in somebody's game that they're playing, and my next move has been scripted by him, and I'll never get to meet him. You cannot have a society that denies a sense of personal accountability. You cannot have a society that ignores the longing of the human spirit for significance. And in the West, that society's been revolving around a Judeo Christian tradition that's under assault. My view of the criminal justice system, my limited role in the world is I embody human values in the courtroom. I recognize the humanity of my client and I fight for him as though I were on a cross and he was the man to my right or my left.
That's an amazing way to put that, and you made another great point in the process. When you talk about AI versus real humans, and you talked about that infinity that we all look at, when if we forget our purpose here on Earth to have that longing for, as you say, that defines humans between AI generated humans, it is that longing. And if we did not have that longing, which government, I think, through all these narratives is trying to take away, without that longing and no purpose, we as a society are beholden to our masters and government, which would just control us, because without that longing, we lose the spirit for more and better and that sense of freedom.
Every dystopian novel, 1984 by Orwell, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. You could go on. Every one of them has a protagonist who refuses to go along with the narrative because they want significance. They're longing for recognition as a unique person. I'd go so far as to say created in the image of God, puts them at odds with their society. What I'm suggesting is that in 21st century America, we've made identity into a God. And conforming to whatever makes every identity feel good has become our public imperative. And the result of it is we've lost a sense of righteousness, we've lost a sense of efficacy, and we've lost a sense of just desserts and significance, because we've come to love ourselves rather than to love God. And so, I'm not a theologian. I read a lot of theology. A few years back, I read through the Catholic Catechism. I was entirely persuaded it was the most satisfying answer to the questions that I've been asking. And so I like to say that I'm half a Christian. I'm well acquainted with sin. I live it. I fall short of the glory of God daily. I'm learning to try to understand grace, and I'm learning to become an instrument of grace. And that's my mission.
I think you're doing just that. So speaking of grace, we were talking about how you represent Alex Jones and the J6ers. Agree with them or not, were their rights violated, or did they violate other people's rights, or are they just being made an example of, or is it because they're easy to make examples of? What's your opinion on that?
So Alex Jones is interesting. I will have been in his life for 5 years come March, and I've gotten to know him really well. And I'm not calling Alex anything that I'm not. He's a sinner in need of grace, and some days he's open to it, and some days he's not, just like the rest of us. I represented him in his struggle with the Sandy Hook families, where he was defaulted for failure to comply with discovery and a series of other things the court perceived as violations sufficient to deprive him of his right to a jury trial. The result is the Sandy Hook families were able to present to the jury the very things they accused Mr. Jones of doing. That is a false narrative. Jones claimed that nobody died at Sandy Hook. I'm 20 miles from Sandy Hook right now as we speak. I know people who lost loved ones at Sandy Hook. There was
Right.
never any doubt in my mind that people died there. Jones got involved in that for reasons of his own, but he's involved in so much more. And so they sued him, and he had a right to defend himself on those charges. And if a jury found him after a full and fair consideration of all in the facts of the case to have defamed them, then hold him accountable. But we never got that trial. What's more, many people decrying Jones are decrying him not because of Sandy Hook, but because of what he says about globalism, because of what he says about corruption in the United States, what he says about illegal immigration. Jones has written a series of books. Another one just came out last month. The one was The Great Reset. I can't recall what the next one is, The Great Emancipation or something like that. Read those books and ask yourself, how many times has he been right over the last few years, and who is it that really wants to silence him? So it's my pleasure and privilege to try to keep Mr. Jones in business in the face of a judicial system that seems callous in its disregard of his rights, and in the face of public opinion where people will take the worst that he's done and try to make that into all that he's done. No one is the sum of their worst moments. Alex Jones may have made mistakes with respect to Sandy Hooks that hurt people. It wasn't anywhere near what the jury was told in the Connecticut case or the Texas case. And I'm working hard to get him a new trial in Connecticut. I know the appellate lawyers are trying to get him a new trial in Texas, and I'll keep at it until the last court in the land says no more.
That's interesting. Like you said, that he's only guilty, or not guilty. He's only being charged because his opinion was that nobody died, and you represented him, even though you knew people that had children who got killed. Correct?
It wasn't a child; it was a teacher, but a person was killed. Yes, and I mean, yes, and so even and he's asserted it as a fact that no one died. He didn't just say it was an opinion. He got on the air and said it, and these people got up and said, but 8 years later, we want to sue you for defamation. Why the timing? This was in 2018 that the suits were filed. Jones said the bulk of what he had to say in 13 and 14. Why the timing? And when we tried to raise this, we were prevented from doing so. Jones thinks that it has something to do with his support of Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and that Hillary made an issue of it, and that these folks came forward in 2018 as retribution for his support of Donald Trump. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when you ask yourself what took 8 years to bring the litigation, that's one answer.
And what's interesting is everybody's accusing Alex Jones of being a conspiracy theorist, but then when you look at, like you said just now, 8 years later, you can't really, I guess, ignore that something is going on behind the scenes, and that if it weren't for people like you that covered it, and like I said earlier, helped people navigate through the system, you end up exposing other things that serve our community, other than just defending somebody who's presumed or should be presumed innocent until they're proven guilty, correct?
Yeah, that's the goal. In the Jones case, we were shut down by a court repeatedly, and Jones was deprived of his right to a jury. He was instructed that he couldn't utter certain things in the jury's presence, and he got up in front of the jury and told the jury that he held the judge in contempt because of the rulings that she made. And candidly, I agreed with him. Now, we'll see what the appellate court does. We think we've got good grounds for an appeal, that the default entry was disproportionate. In other words, the claim wasn't that Jones had failed to participate in discovery. He just didn't give the plaintiffs everything they wanted. The jury should have been told that he didn't do that. And if they wanted to draw an adverse inference, let them. But to say that because you didn't give the plaintiff everything they wanted when they sued you, but you nonetheless gave them tens, if not hundreds of thousands of documents, had your employees sit for dozens of depositions, answered requests to admit under oath, and participated in the process, even on a flawed basis, because you didn't satisfy the people who sued you, you get defaulted and lose your right to defend yourself. That's grotesque.
Right. That's an interesting way to put it. The narratives are so powerful, especially in his case and with the J6ers, which we'll talk about more here in just a minute. But the narratives are so powerful. I believe they're being used in a way that infringes our rights. It's almost like being made to feel guilty about our First Amendment rights. I always say that people say, well, our First Amendment rights being taken away, and I agree with that. But one way I think it's happening is in the narratives. These narratives get created, and then if you don't agree with the narratives, you feel guilty about speaking out against them. Or if you speak out against them, you become the conspiracy theorist because you're going against the grain of the narrative. Hence, you lose your First Amendment right because out of either guilt or being called a conspiracy theorist. So are the narratives out there gaining steam, or are the videos and other forms of proof gaining enough steam, like the different things that are coming out about these people? Are they gaining enough steam to overcome those narratives?
The narrative issue that you raise is really interesting because I'm obviously at the center of controversy with Alex Jones. I spent 5.5 months earlier this year on trial in Washington, D.C. with Joe Biggs. It's one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, and watched the government create out of whole cloth a conspiracy that there was no evidence to support. The government, and so what happens is the narratives become the context in which circumstantial evidence is presented, and you draw and the inference. So what's circumstantial evidence? And I want to disabuse your viewers of something.
Right.
People say it's only circumstantial evidence. Every jury in the United States that is instructed on circumstantial evidence is told the following: circumstantial evidence can be as probative, as proof worthy as direct evidence. We rely on it all the time. Classic example: you go to bed, you look out your window, you see your lawn. You wake up, you see snow on the lawn and footprints going through it. You didn't see anybody walk across your lawn. You didn't even see it snow, but you infer, you draw an inference from what you can observe that it snowed last night and somebody walked across the lawn. You do that because the narrative that we all share, at least I think we all share,
Right.
is that in some seasons, white precipitation it can fall to the ground and accumulate, and we call that snow. That drives the narrative. When you have other competing narratives in the social realm, you begin to draw inferences that are reasonable within the context of a narrative that you share with others, but may not be reasonable otherwise. Consider the George Floyd death in Minneapolis in 2020. I've represented scores of people in claims against police officers for unreasonable force. I've defended many police officers accused of using unreasonable force. George Floyd was not a victim of systemic racism. George Floyd died as a result of his treatment that day, but I don't know that Derek Chauvin killed him. What I do know is he had enough fentanyl in him to choke a horse. What I do know is he was claiming he couldn't breathe when he was sitting in the squad car upright. What I do know is he resisted officers who had legitimate right to hold him briefly in custody. What I do know is he was squirming on the ground, and the officer used a takedown technique that he was taught to use. Did he have his knee on the upper torso for too long a period, and should officers be trained otherwise? That's an open question. But did he have reason to believe he was killing Floyd when Floyd said, "I can't breathe, I want my mama"? I mean, these are common cries for every person in the United States that gets arrested, and cops are
Right.
hard pressed to know when it's legitimate and when it's not. But the New York Times and the 1619 Project taught us that American history, the grand narrative, is all about racial oppression and white supremacy. Therefore, let's burn cities in mostly peaceful protests. Therefore, let's defund the police. Therefore, let's make the Floyd family into multimillionaires. And the list goes on. I think a lot of Americans reject that narrative, and they know it's nonsense, and they don't want to live in a plantation where they're suddenly the new slaves, paying for their ancestors, grandparents and ancestors, new word
I like that new word.
for their sins and omissions. I think we have an aspiration to be equal before the law. So when I viewed Trump's election in 2016, I thought that was forgotten, silent people that aren't accounted for in flyover country. If you look at recent polls, they show Trump doing better than Biden in spite of the indictments and the 91 criminal counts.
Right.
I think there are a lot of people who feel they're being overlooked by a media that's trying to sell them a narrative that doesn't correspond to their lived reality. And I think 2024 is going to be very interesting. I think we have a crisis of legitimacy in the country. And I think people need to stay. If you see something that looks crazy, say something about it. Don't be silent, because silence is
Exactly.
violence. It's violence to the truth. It's violence to the reality that you live in. It's the creation of a narrative that may victimize you. Speak up. So, that's my answer.
I love that. What I get from that is, don't let the narrative soften you up. Like, if you believe in something, you see facts in front of you. Don't let the narratives that you hear every day, change your mind or make you kind of go, well, I'm really not gonna get involved in that because I might believe this, but the narratives say this, so I'm just gonna be quiet and go away. Because then you are now a victim of the narratives and what the people who want to take our freedoms away are doing to you. Do you think that the narratives are being used, or these people, the J6ers and other people that, like, the George Floyd killer or the policeman that killed him, Alex Jones? Do you think that these guys are the narrative are being used to water down our constitutional rights, take theirs away? You know,
Possibly. especially and the J6 case is
Did I say that the
very
right way there? I don't always do things in legal terms. I do things in more passionate terms.
passionate. Hey, look, the law is just a tool. I mean, if you look at the Constitution, what is due process of law? What's it? Which is in the Fifth and 14th Amendment. What is an unreasonable search in the 14th Amendment? What exactly is the scope of freedom of expression? These are broad terms that get defined each generation by a consensus, and so this what you refer to as passion, I would refer to as a search for common meaning, and it's always contested. And the reason there are always cases in front of the Supreme Court and nothing ever gets settled for long is that people come to differ about what's reasonable depending on how circumstances change. So I say passion and narrative drive the system. The law is simply its tool. The task of a lawyer is to understand his client's interest in the context of the law as it exists at that time and to use the law to defend his client and to try to change the law and challenge the law when the law doesn't serve his client's interest. I don't have a grasp of some sort of geometric conception of what justice is or what right is. I just know that we have to struggle together to learn to live together. I hate to make everything a classics lesson, but the
Oh
Romans.
no, I'm loving this. I love educating my listeners. Look, real quick. I used to be the guy on the right that just wanted to repeat the right wing narratives, and then when I started talking to more people about the rights and our Constitution and really getting into talking to people on both sides, you find that we can unite on more things than we realize.
Oh
And
yeah.
so I try to have a more educational based podcast. People know that I'm on the right. People know that I'm Republican minded, but I want to bring more information to the table so that we can see that there's more things that unite us on freedom and liberty than what we realize and what and that we're being divided up on those narratives. And like I asked you a minute ago on those narratives, when we talk about Alex Jones or the J6ers or the police officer that was accused of killing George Floyd, and we look at the narratives that are surrounding that, are the narratives being used to take away their constitutional rights, or is it making them look so bad that we assume that the Constitution should not apply to them because they're so bad? Hence, it waters down our own constitutional rights in the meantime.
No, I mean, look, here's the bottom line. Everybody's a sinner. And so, everybody is trying to turn the Constitution to their own interests and make it speak for them. I mean, for example, should African Americans be paid reparations for a legacy of slavery? There are many people who say yes. I passionately believe otherwise. I don't believe I did it. And I don't believe in race-based transfer payments. I believe the United States Constitution should be amended to prohibit it. I've written about that, and I support it. I've talked about it whenever I get a chance to do so. And
You
the reason
support?
for an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit race-based transfer payments. The
Okay.
United States Supreme Court just ended affirmative action in the colleges. That's a step in the right direction, in my view. I think the only way to end discrimination, Chief Justice Roberts said in a case involving the Seattle School District, is to stop discriminating, and I think he's right. But yet, what we have now is a competition for narratives, and the victim narrative is one that is supposed to make you and I, as white males, responsible for everything that's wrong in everyone else's life. I got one word for that. That's a combination of two, and I'll be polite. It's bull, and you can know what the last word is. And I intend to have the last word in every fight on that issue, whether it be on a podcast, in a debate publicly, or in a courtroom. Because I think the Constitution, this is what I was starting to talk about earlier. Cicero once said that a republic, a res publica, a commonwealth, that's a cognate word in Latin, isn't just a collection of people. It's a people bound together with common interests and a common conception of right. And what makes the Constitution endearing, what makes it vital, is the very passion that you talk about. So when you said earlier, I want to make sure I get the legal terms right, I'm just talking about my passions. The passions is where the Constitution begins because it's that energy, it's that conception of right that infuses and gives meaning to the bold and broad language of our constitutional system. So I wouldn't, I don't ever defer to a lawyer in a discussion about public policy. Ask the lawyer what the law is doing to serve the conception of right that you believe in here in our society, and challenge the law to change, because that's what's going on in Supreme Court litigation each and every day. People with interest are trying to change the meaning of the law to serve their interests. And if you don't believe that the way they are conceiving of their interest is consistent with yours, fight back. That's what it's all about.
And use your
There's
passion, not the law.
I like to tell the young lawyers in my office, the fight is all there is. Don't get into this life unless you want to be a professional prize fighter.
What can you say to the audience to make them see not only this passion and what you're talking about, that sometimes we have to look past the narratives and try harder with our passion to see that their rights are still important and preserved in the system that we have?
I don't really know. I mean, I'm not running for office. I'm not a politician. I'm just a lawyer with a loud mouth. But I can tell you, after hundreds of courtroom fights, maybe thousands at this point in my career, that I'm always impressed by the dignity of the judicial process when I stand next to an accused person. And it's my responsibility and my goal to make sure that no one ever forgets that person's humanity, because no one is the sum of their least moments, not anyone. And we forget that at our peril. So I don't think I need to do anything to inspire people to take themselves seriously. What I do think I need to do is remind people to don't take the narrative seriously. If it doesn't feel, if you're, I stopped watching network news 3 4 years ago. The only thing I turn the television on now is for college sports. I don't even watch entertainment on television, and in large part because of the ads. They try too hard. I mean, you're going to see an ad. We'd like you to use our embryo grow. If you're having trouble conceiving, take 2 pills and you'll be having a baby in a week. And what do they show? They
Not
show a
frog
black.
babies, right?
No, they show a black guy and a white woman, because you can't have
Right.
two white people in an ad. And then
Exactly.
they show an Asian baby as though they somehow took a pill and produced because we got to serve diversity. It's
Exactly
just
right.
ridiculous. Why put
I'm
up with that?
noticing the same thing, Norm. I've been saying the same thing. You're reading my mind. It's like I look at these commercials. I go, wait a minute. You'll have like these friends get together, and there's always like some ethnicity that that group is unlikely for them to have, and
Wait a
not that
minute. We don't have a disabled Filipino. Stop the beer commercial. I
right.
don't want to drink your beer at that point. I don't stop trying so hard. And I think if the American people just put their foot down and said, like the whole controversy over Budweiser, do I
Yeah.
really need to have transgender beer? I really don't. And I'll drink something else before I get politicized when I want to relax. If enough of us stood up and did that, if we said, hell no, we won't go along with the narrative will change. And so watch what happens in 2024. I think it might be interesting.
Do you think that there's a power play in place that's overcharging people in these cases that you're like the ones
Oh,
you
hell yeah.
representative and they're over criminalizing people and they're strong arming the ones that they can make examples of in order to water down other citizens' rights, even the law
Yes.
abiding ones?
Yes. Here, let me show you something. I think the Justice Department is totally out of control. And in 2024, I would vote for this pumpkin to be president of the United States over a
It does look like a character of Donald Trump, though. I mean, come on.
I would vote for this pumpkin as president of the United States before I'd vote for a Democrat. Why? Because Merrick Garland, in my view, has become a war criminal. What he has done to the Justice Department and its criminalization of dissent is, in my view, unheralded in American history. What am I talking about? Look at the J6 prosecutions. Now, let's go back a century or so in American history. We had a civil war, divided the country for 4 years. 600,000 Americans died. We killed one another in the tens of thousands while we worked out our dispute about our national destiny. Within 3 4 years of the end of the Civil War, almost every rebel had been repatriated, and we went about the task of nation building. Here we are 3 years later, 3 years after a 6 or 7 hour riot in the Capitol that spun out of control, and we're still prosecuting people. We're still looking to lock them up for 10, 20, 30 years. The Proud Boys case, in my view, was obscene. The Proud Boys attended the rally. There was no evidence, no direct evidence presented at trial of any plan to engage in insurrection. They had cooperating witnesses, rats, who got on this. One of them, whom got on the stand, he was a leader. He said, "No, there was no plan. We just had some understanding." The prosecution argued to the jury in closing arguments that a conspiracy could be formed at any time, even at the moment they stormed the barricades. What happened on January 6th is angry people who felt that they were losing control of their country appeared at a riot. President Trump, or at a protest, which they had every right to do. President Trump encouraged them to stop the steal. He had every right to believe that. I don't think he engaged in insurrection. I know, because I've reviewed thousands of hours of evidence, that there was no plan to do this. But yet the narrative is there was, and we have to punish it. So the jury, a D.C. jury, if you want to talk about a company town, try to pick a jury in Washington, D.C. For somebody on the right. Most federal jury selections take a day at most. It took us 12 days to seat a jury in the Proud Boys case because we just couldn't get people who could commit to be fair and impartial. We sat a jury and in this company town where everybody either works for the government or serves somebody who does work for the government. It's not even a state. And, look at the Sixth Amendment. It says when you're charged with a crime, there's something called the vicinage clause, the vicinity. Every person has a right to be charged in the district and state where they were charged. Washington, D.C. is not a state. And it's not a state for a reason. We didn't want it to be captive when the federal government was a minor player in the federal relationship between state and governments. We didn't want the federal government to be subsumed or overly influenced by its host. So the federal Constitution gives several square miles of land in D.C. To the creation of the government. These guys never had a chance in that courtroom. And when the prosecution argued this conspiracy could have been formed at the moment it occurred and used their prior speech when they spoke out about politics, when they spoke out in their belief that the election was stolen, when they spoke out about their belief that the country was moving in the wrong direction, when they engaged in passionate discourse about the need to preserve American values, when they chanted 1776, that chant was used as circumstantial evidence of criminal intent. When they did all of these things and a riot took place, they were accused of causing the riot to occur. It's a ridiculous assertion, and I simply believe it to be wrong. And I'm going to be filing briefs for two of the Proud Boys at that trial in the appellate courts early next year. I'm not sure what the due date is. I'm working on them now, and I intend to get that case in front of the United States Supreme Court. In fact, just yesterday we filed briefs for Owen Schroyer, who was pled guilty to trespass on January 6th. At sentencing, the government said he spread disinformation. He encouraged his listeners to believe the election was stolen. I said, that's protected speech, Judge. You can't put him in prison because of protected speech. The judge called it relevant offense conduct. You want to talk about freedom being under assault? I think many Americans are afraid to speak up right now because Merrick Garland and his band of happy knuckleheads in the Justice Department are going to take your words. And if you go to a protest where something goes wrong, they're going to smear you with it and try to lock you up for 10, 20, 30 years. And again, well, I'm sorry to go on a tear like this.
No, I'm loving every minute of this. And this is, we got a lot more time.
So. You hit a hot button with me on this one. When after trial in federal court, when people are sentenced, the court has to use something called sentencing guidelines. It's a giant cookbook. The government sought to have these men designated, the Proud Boys, as terrorists, thus doubling their sentences. And what was their justification? Under the sentencing guidelines, a person is a terrorist if they commit one of 47 some other federal offenses in the course of committing the offense that they were found guilty of. One of them was obstruction of property. The others were things like nuclear terrorism, bioweapons, killing a congressman, assassinating the president, kidnapping a public official. The property that was destroyed at issue in this case that was a $32,000 fence that many people trampled on. Judge Timothy J. Kelly said, well, that's destruction of property, and therefore they're terrorists. The result is they're in harsher conditions of confinement. Additionally, they were initially designated, I have good reason to believe, as low-risk detainees. The District of Columbia's top prosecutor's office insisted that they be designated medium risks, which means they have harsher conditions of confinement. It's obscene. And in Owen's case, his speech was used even though it was recommended by people who prepared a pre-sentence report on him that he be given probation, he was required to go to jail for 60 days. And then he was locked up in solitary in jail for talking to people on the phone. And those people broadcast what he said on the phone. So is the government criminalizing dissent? You bet they are. And are you letting it?
And they keep on using the narratives to double down on what they're on them in a way that we get other. So look, I've got attorney friends and that are, smart people, that are still saying, oh, those J6ers deserve, but they should be done this. And I'm like, you guys know the law, but you're overlooking, they're listening to the narratives more than they are looking at the law, and they're attorneys. And I hear them talking. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm in this case talk to more enough attorneys that I can see that their legal rights are being violated. And and to my attorney friends, you're still listening to the narratives over the law. So I mean, I get how powerful these narratives are in this case.
I was asked late in the development of the Proud Boys case to come in and assist. And I did, because I wanted to know more what happened on January 6th. I'm reading the papers. I don't trust the narrative. I came not to trust the narratives in the Alex Jones case, where I would see one thing happen in court and I'd see the reporting, and the reporting was narrative driven rather than fact driven. I saw that in the New York Times. I saw it in other publications. And so I thought, I want to get a front row seat at history. And so I did. And what I saw shocked me and candidly radicalized me. I will probably spend what remains of my career, which I hope is another 10 years or so, fighting Proud Boy type cases, because I think what the United States government has done with respect to January 6th is draw a line in the sand. And it's creating a narrative that will resonate in American history, similar to that after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There are lots of conspiracy theorists out there right now. House Speaker Mike Johnson just released 44,000 hours of video, and people are looking at it and they'll see a video that corresponds to their bias, and they'll say, that's the prism that explains it all. Be careful, folks. That was a complicated event with a lot of causes. Do I know whether there were confidential human sources from the FBI embedded in the Proud Boys and participating in January 6th? Yes, I do. I'm under court order not to talk about what I know, because we had sealed proceedings in the Proud Boys trial. Think about that. In spite of the First Amendment right of public access to the courts, in spite of the history this country has with respect to the Church Committee and the use of law enforcement to surveil the left, we're now in a situation where we openly have law enforcement embedded in right-wing groups and judges ordering their lawyers not to talk about it. I've just this past week, on behalf of a group called Condemned USA, filed a Freedom of Information request to the FBI asking for more information. We had meetings in the Proud Boys trial with senior Justice Department officials who, in exchange for our not asking so many questions, gave us a stipulation that there were at least 8 confidential human sources embedded in the Proud Boys from the end of the general election in 2020 until January 6, 2021. We know there were more. We just don't know how many more there were. We know there's a secret bureaucracy in the FBI that manages these people. We know that FBI officials stonewalled Congress, and Congress didn't insist on answers. And we've gotten half the truth and not the whole truth. So let's get it out there. Let's get it on.
It was interesting. You referred to the videos a minute ago. Now that we see these videos that are now coming out, that shows that there's probably a lot of government plans. There's probably a lot of provocation from the government to not only incite the violence and the uprising, so to speak, that came about as a result of January 6th. Now we're having more and more proof that there's something else going on, that maybe these January 6ers are being made an example of. But also, to your point about, I didn't realize that when you said Donald Trump's being charged in D.C. and it's a violation of our Constitution that says it has to be within a state.
That's a quirk. You're not going to find it. What the Constitution says is that a person has a right to be charged in the state and vicinity of where the crime took place. Now, can mean a number of things. As for lawyers, your lawyer listeners are probably chuckling right now. Does that mean that you can only be charged in a state? That's one argument. It's not a very persuasive argument, because that would deprive the District of Columbia of the ability ever to charge anyone with a crime within its district, and that's an irrational result. But I do think that when motions were made to change the venue in this case, to get it out of DC, and they were denied, there are problems there. Whether those problems are significant enough to result in a new trial, I kind of doubt it. I don't think the change of venue issues are winners in that case. But it was troubling to pick a jury there. I'd never seen anything quite like it.
It reminds me. I interviewed. I don't know if you're familiar with the United American Patriots. Bull Gerfin. Bull, I've had Bull on my show a couple times, and he talks about how we have veterans that fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, and how they got charged with war crimes. based on what president was in office, basically, who determined, what's a war crime or not. But those guys got brought to Washington, D.C. Instead of being tried by a jury of their peers, they got tried in D.C., where the jury was picked from, basically from their commander's group of friends that were charging them with the
Well,
crimes. And these guys got are getting put in jail, for crimes in a jury pool in DC. You know where I'm going with this.
I do. Let me tell you a story about the J6 Proud Boys jury. We sent jury questionnaires out, and a significant number of jurors had marched or knew somebody who had marched in left wing rallies in the city. Not one had marched in a Stop the Steal rally. A significant number of them knew the Proud Boys. Not one knew the Proud Boys and liked them. A significant number of them knew and supported Antifa, an antagonistic group to the Proud Boys. Not one was opposed to Antifa. You would think that a reviewing court at one point, after 6 or 7 days, I'd had enough, and I erupted to the court that I thought this was an obscene charade. Of course, the
Yeah.
court didn't agree, and the trial went on. But it is obscene. I think this is a case, the Proud Boys case, where a different result would have obtained if that case were tried elsewhere.
Because that's
Now, having said that, did they trespass? Yeah. Were we open to entering guilty pleas on minor charges? Absolutely. But Joe Biggs, for example, was a military veteran, Purple Heart recipient for bravery. Had served in Iraq as a point of the tip of the spear on road patrols, and had suffered traumatic brain injuries as a result. He didn't want to lose his military benefits, and so he wouldn't plead to conspiracy to commit insurrection, and the government got its conviction on that. He lost his military benefits. So here was a guy who gave us his youth, who gave us his health,
right.
who put his life on the line, who then went to protest because he thought an election was stolen, and there could be nothing more fundamental, no more fundamental threat to America than a stolen election. Got involved and swept up in a riot, and the result is now he's going to spend, I guess, 17 years in prison, unless I can correct this, and lose his health benefits for this youth he's sacrificed to this country. What in the hell is wrong with you, Merrick Garland? How do you sleep at night?
Well, like you said, what we're seeing now is people being stripped of their rights, made examples of because of the narratives. And I think it's watering down freedom from other people. And you talked about constitutional rights here. I guess we talked about Bill Gerfins, talked about DC. John Eastman was on my show last
Oh,
week, and he talked about how much of our Constitution was violated in the last election. Because it says that the Constitution says that our states, our legislatures, are in control of the elections, and he showed how many lower government agencies took that over. And then also I'm getting ready to bring on somebody else next week who's getting ready to talk about how our Fourth Amendment's being violated because the FBI is able to surveil you without a warrant, but they're doing it through the apps on your phone, through the advertising apps on your phone. So there's all these different ways that our rights are being violated.
When you get your Fourth Amendment guest on, ask him if there is one anymore. I mean, last I knew, there were so many exceptions to the Fourth Amendment. And all the Fourth Amendment says is the government, the people shall be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and it's left to each generation of jurists and each society at each moment to decide what's reasonable. And I think that if you value security more than you do liberty, then it's reasonable to abandon restrictions on searches and seizures. If you value a narrative that says Black Lives Matter and white people who assert their own are domestic extremists, then what's reasonable becomes somewhat different. I think it's important to fight for a race neutral interpretation of the Constitution. And it's important never to forget that we created a limited government, and never to forget that government was never supposed to be the solution to life's destiny. We were supposed to work that out for ourselves, between ourselves and our God, in our communities. And to the extent we permit the federal government to set an agenda on how we shall live, we shall lose our liberty.
I love this. Yeah, I have a few more questions. If you have a few more minutes, I'm going to
Sure,
get to
just you.
these.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You, because
I'm
you've
getting
got
ready to go. I'm getting ready to head north for Thanksgiving. So if you see me looking, it's just like I want to be, I want to go play in the woods, get
well,
away from it
I'm
all.
a hope that these next questions are good enough to keep your attention for a few more minutes because you've got some great information that I value and I'm grateful for your time. But
Thank you
what do
for
you
having
think
me.
is? Well, I'm grateful. I really am. I got to tell you, I'm going to say something at the end that you'll be impressed with. What do you think is the best way to protect personal rights, protect our constitutional rights, and still just have justice for the populace and still lower recidivism? Because I think ultimately the justice system is about lowering recidivism, and it wasn't designed to take away people's rights. It was, I guess, designed as a way to lower recidivism, and I might be shortening the process that our founders discussed. But what do you think is the best way to protect those rights?
I think there are concrete criminal justice reforms that can take place in every jurisdiction. I think that we should have a right to have juries decide punishment, or at least make a recommendation. They should know the consequences of what's going to happen if they vote guilty. In other words, we should have a limited right to jury nullification in the United States. In most jurisdictions, juries are told that you can't worry about what happens if the man is convicted. Your job is simply to decide whether the government proved its case. I had a case many years ago involving a couple of young men in a dispute over a girl. And my guy pulled out a gun and shot the other guy to death in the presence of three people, two of whom had knew him for life, or known him for life. There wasn't a lot to be done in that case, but the plea bargain was harsh. He was convicted, and the court gave him a light sentence for murder, light in Connecticut, of 45 years. A juror from the case called me a couple days later, beside herself. She was enraged. She said, "Why didn't you tell us what would happen if we voted guilty?" I said, "Because the law wouldn't permit me." But then I said to her, if I had, what would you have done? Well, she said he was guilty. So I think this was a case where jurors were emasculated, and they weren't set free to consider the totality of the circumstances and to make a sentencing recommendation to the judge. Second issue, I think that the public has a right. The First Amendment says we have a right of public access to the courts, but in many state systems, plea bargaining takes place privately, out of public view. And by the time cases are put on the record, the public has no idea what went into the plea bargaining. Let the public know how we make the sausage we call justice, and then ask the public, do you like how it tastes now that you know what's in it? Because it's easy to say lock them up and throw away the key. I think it's more important to understand the nature of proof, the circumstances that led to the commission of the crime, and then to make a calibrated judgment about what to do. Third, I think we've gone too far with giving victims rights. An ancient maxim in the law was no person can be a judge in her own case. So how is it possible then that we demand that the family of a murder victim be heard at every stage of the proceeding? How can they be a judge in their own case? They can bring an action against the accused if need be, but as a society, we need to decide how much punishment is enough. Usually, Norway, I think the maximum sentence is 23 years. Why would we have life sentences here? Why would we be passing them out like candy? Why do we pass out 50, 40, 50, 60-year sentences? Why do we offer a plea bargain? As I mentioned earlier to the baby off the bridge case, here's a plea offer, take 50 years. I mean, are you serious? I mean, I said that to the judge. I mean, seriously? You call
Yeah.
this a plea offer? We're going to trial. What do we got to lose?
Yeah, 50 years. Yeah, 50 years is probably his life,
Yeah.
at the time. But like I said, I used to be a lock 'em up kind of guy too, and I'm still a tough on crime guy, but I'm also, like you said, I look at things in society. We have ways, and I don't mean this in the worst way possible. It's going to sound bad as I say it. We have ways in society to ruin somebody's life right now. You could take the most hardened criminal and ruin their life outside of jail more than you can ruin their life inside of jail. You strip somebody of their rights in society, they're going to be living homeless on the streets. They're not going to have access to money. They're going to be able to make a living or anything like that. Do you think that's something? And I don't mean do that as a way of getting rid of jail sentencing, but is that not an alternative? But is that something to look at?
Yes, yes, and there are people from whom society does need protection. I mean, I get it, and there are some people that aren't ever going to be reformed. I get that too. I mean, I'm watching events in the Middle East with Hamas. I mean, Hamas has made me rethink my opposition to the death penalty. The kind of savagery that was engaged in there, kidnapping children,
Right.
raping grandmothers, holding them hostage, burying them beneath civilian components, and daring your adversaries to do something about it. Hamas is beyond the level of what I'm prepared to tolerate in a civilized society. And as a result, Hamas, yeah, you've educated me. Maybe there is a purpose to the death penalty. Maybe there is a point at which society needs protection against people who are prepared to do just about anything to get what they want, including attack the very foundation of our civilization, how we care for and cherish young, how we care for and cherish the women in our society, how we care for and cherish the elderly. You want to attack that? You've got no sympathy from me, none. And so I think that in our domestic societies, there are some crimes that are so heinous that there is no fixing the solution. But we need, and I think the participants in the criminal justice system have difficulty. They're afraid that they're going to make the wrong decision. They're afraid that this is the guy that's going to come out and do it again, and therefore we're going to hammer everybody. And that's a real problem. But I also think that sentence review every 10 years, for example, might be appropriate. In the Old Testament, Israel every 50 years would have a jubilee year. They'd forgive everybody their debts and hit a reset button saying, let's start over again. I think that in the criminal justice system, we should reset everybody's sentences 10 years in. Let's see how they're doing, because I'm aware of some people for whom prison was a transformative experience, and they're wonderful human beings now. I'm aware of others who prison made worse. Free the latter, free the former, keep the latter, I say.
I love this. Well, the last question I have for you, Norm, I gotta tell you how much I could keep you on for another hour, but I'm not going to, because I know you've got those woods on your mind.
I do.
But
I'm a lifelong goof off, and I'm ready to play.
well, I'm getting ready to do a show on I believe, well, I've always talked about freedom, but I'm getting ready to do a show specifically on how I believe that freedom has run through man's veins since man has, was created, and I believe that, our creator endowed us with our unalienable rights, but our creator granted us free will. He granted us that desire for freedom. And as you said earlier, it's that what makes us the difference between humans and AI generated, clones, is that desire for, as you put it, how'd you put it?
Significance.
Significance for eternity, for, and that comes through freedom that's woven in our DNA. And it has come out in the history of man in the 12 pillars, the Magna Carta, and the Constitution, which I'm getting ready to do a show on these three. Do you have any insight on what you would have to say to add to that? So when I do that podcast, I would love to have some future information from you.
I don't really, but I think the Anglo-American tradition is unique, and I think that we disrespect it at our peril. Magna Carta, the developments of the English Civil War, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. These didn't spring up by chance at random parts of the world, and weren't stitched together randomly by somebody who was on a weekend's toot and said, let's see what happens. They reflect a culture. They reflect a society. They reflect a Ciceronian commitment to common values, the integrity of the individual, the common sense embrace of what we all know to be true, that we make choices and should be held accountable for them, and that we want a society where everyone matters. That's what the Anglo-American tradition is about. That's what the Judeo-Christian tradition is about. The Judeo-Christian tradition gives it a theological context. When we open our borders to the world and say, nothing matters, come on in, the water's fine, swim any way you like, we're watering down that tradition at our peril. And so I would say, bring this culture war on. Bring it. Let's be honest about it. Let's be aggressive. It's time to fight for the West before the West is gone.
I love it. Norm, any final words? Anything that you'd like to share with people? How can find you? I absolutely have loved our time, and I got to tell you, I think that your interview is going to be one of my favorite interviews on my podcast yet. I've received not only a lot of value from your information, I've learned a little bit more about forgiveness, and I've learned how to be more grateful, for what we have in the way of freedom. Any final words for our audience?
No, read, read the Bible. Get your head out of the television. Get your head out of TikTok, and ask yourself what made us great, and what can you do to continue to maintain that greatness. None of us are going to die heroes. We're all going to die miserable deaths. It's the nature of the world. But while you're alive, let that light shine and fight for something. Fight for something that you're proud of, because if you don't fight, somebody will make you ashamed.
I love it. Norm, hang on one second while I close out.
Right.
I want to thank everybody for sharing some time with me. I'm grateful for your time, and I'd be even more grateful if you'd share this interview, share this podcast with somebody, because I really feel that it's a way to help our society benefit from just having more knowledge. Thank you all very much, and tune in for the next podcast that's coming up soon. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you, Norm.
Thanks. Be well, everyone.